Hey everybody, it's Chris, and I'm on the Survivor Couch at Annie Appleseed 2019 with my friend Jane McLelland. Jane is a almost 15-year survivor of stage 4 cancer.
Yes.
And she and I have been, well, we met on Facebook a few years ago. We met in person in London a couple of years ago. And she has a really, really good book that's very different than anything else I've read. And it's maybe a little controversial, which is good. Yeah, which is good. So I'm excited to get into this. You're going to hear things from Jane you've never heard before, and she really opened my eyes and opened my mind to some things that I had never heard of, never really thought about. I heard of a little, but didn't. She connected a lot of dots for me, and I know this is all kind of like teaser stuff because you're like, what are you talking about? But we're going to get into it. But specifically about using low-dose off-label drugs to target and destroy starved cancer cells. So you're going to like this interview a lot, and you'll want to buy her book because it's great. So, hi, Jane.
Hi, Chris.
Good to see you again.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm so excited to do this. We're in Florida.
Good place to be.
Yep.
Especially in February. March now.
It is March now. Yes.
It's a short month.
Good weather, and a lot of sweet people at this conference. I'm speaking later today, and so I'm just glad to be here.
Good to see you, Chris.
Good to see you. So let's start with your story before we get into, well, because your story actually is this whole, your mission and message and the information you share is all based on your experience.
Exactly.
And so, let's talk about it.
I wouldn't have this book without having been through the whole cancer experience that most people who are watching this are actually going through at the moment. So I've been in their shoes. I know what it's like. I know it's a tough road out there. It really is. And there's a lot of things flying at you from all kinds of different directions, and you don't know which path is right for you. So it's a very, very confusing picture, mostly. For anybody going onto the internet and having a look, it's just a hodgepodge of all sorts of different things. There's cannabis, there's keto, there's all sorts of stuff going on out there. The chat is incessant, and they kind of get a little bit religious sometimes, some people, about sort of what path should be right for you. And I think everybody's different. Their cancers are all different. And that's something I try and convey in the book, that I've actually worked out the kind of different metabolic drivers of why cancer is different in different people, and why you can actually target it more specifically by working out what actually drives, what feeds the cancer, so you can work out the kind of diet that you need to adopt, and also the kind of supplements and the off-label drugs as well, which you mentioned. So all of that is really important, and it's quite key to sort of getting as much as you can, because cancer, as we know, is a complex disease. It's not a straightforward thing. If it was just as simple as going on a diet, everybody would be better. But unfortunately, it's a bit more complicated like that. So, there are supplements that really help, and there are these off-label drugs. So I'll wind back to my story.
Mm-hmm. And before you do, I'll just say, I have strong beliefs held loosely. So what that means is, yes, I'm very passionate about what I believe because of all the research I've done, but I'm also have maintained objectivity. Like, I've really tried to stay open and learn and read and research, because at the end of the day, what I do, it's not about being right, it's about helping people. Right? And so it's like, what can help people the most? Is there anything out there? So I used to think, for example, the ketogenic diet could be helpful. My opinion on that has changed. I've got an article about it you guys can read, and we can talk about it too. But I used to think that pharmaceutical drugs had no benefit, right? I mean, not completely, but I was pretty turned off, especially when I was going through my cancer journey.
Yeah.
I was completely turned off to any pharmaceutical drug. And but as I've read and researched and actually look at the science, I've found some very compelling information, and some of that through you, for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is more of kind of a preface, but your story.
Okay, right. So in '94, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. At that point, it had spread to my lymph nodes, and I kind of got it in my head that they were going to kill me with the chemo and the radiotherapy and the huge surgery and all the normal stuff. So I did all of that.
Wait, you said 94?
94.
Okay, I said 15-year. No, it's
No,
25.
well, that's my initial
Yeah.
diagnosis.
So 25-year survivor, not 15. Chris was wrong.
So, yeah, well, actually, from my last bout of cancer was 2004.
Okay.
So, but we'll get to that in a sec. But I started off cervix, went to my lungs, which of course is stage 4 in 1999, and I had been completely, before that, just not really acknowledging what I had to do. I didn't see that I was meant to be doing anything different. I was a chartered physiotherapist at the time, and I was working in a hospital. Completely trusted myself to the medical profession to get me well.
And you did all the standard treatments.
Loads of it. I mean, they obviously thought my condition was worse than I realised, and I didn't know that. You know, I was told I was a stage 1B, which is a kind of, you know, lulls you into a full sense of security, but that's a specific kind of staging for my particular type of cancer. In fact, it's stage 3 in any other cancer because it's gone to the lymph nodes. But I didn't kind of acknowledge that. I wanted to just assume I was going to be fine. But actually, my mother got breast cancer before I got my cancer, and then she got stage 4. She went to her liver in 1999. So 2 years later, my mother is now on, dying. And that was a serious wake-up call to me. I mean, I just wanted to find something, and it was, okay, stage 4 is incurable. And I was stage 3. I was only one stage away from, no options. And that was a real, scary moment for me. But I did everything I possibly could to try and save my mum. I was looking everywhere for her.
And were you looking at alternative, complementary, holistic
stuff to get, and I was asking her to change her diet and all of this sort of thing. But, it was really hard because she was of the age where you just worship your doctor and you do as you're told. And who was I? I was just a physiotherapist. And so...
And there's an important point in that story too, which is that sometimes it's really hard to help somebody else. Right.
That sometimes you get conflict within your family with people saying things that, so it can be very hard when you've got one approach and somebody's trying to tell you something different, and you can be very blocked to listening to anybody else. And it's a minefield, actually. You're in conflict with, you end up being in conflict with the medical profession. You end up possibly being in conflict with some of your friends and family. And you're in conflict with your cancer as well. It's kind of a trio of disaster.
Yeah.
It's a really bad situation for any cancer patient, but that's where we are. This is the situation today.
You feel really alone.
Yeah, totally.
Because you feel like everyone else disagrees with you.
Yeah.
And then in your case...
Well, I was definitely forging a new path for myself. Nobody else I knew was doing anything like that. So when, my mum didn't last very long with stage 4, she was... from the moment she told me, it was about 6 to 8 weeks before she died. So
had you had your recurrence at that point?
No. So I then so that was a wake-up call to change my diet. So I'd already changed my diet. I'd already done an awful lot of researching, and I'd implemented green tea into my diet, and I'd started taking curcumin and some key supplements. And then in 99 it was diagnosed in my lungs. I think it'd been there a while, in fact, but because I was misdiagnosed with an X-ray, but so I think it had been many months actually. But that in itself, when you're stage 4 with cervical cancer, that only has a mean survival of 3 months. So the fact that I've been surviving was kind of a message to me that whatever I'd done with my diet was helping. Didn't matter if somebody else was telling me it wasn't helping. I looked at the X-ray that had been done months before and compared it with the sort of the current one that I had then, and I could tell with the sort of growth of the tumour that actually it wasn't, they completely missed it the first time, that the growth was actually relatively slow, and it's all about controlling the growth and actually slowing things down and starving it to stop it actually increasing its metabolic need. So that was, to me, it was a message that actually I was starving it by changing my diet. I incorporated a bit more exercise into my routine, and then, when I was diagnosed with a stage 4, I started doing the intravenous vitamin C, as well as having a huge dose of, this was after a massive dose of chemo, which I had to go through for 6 months, but that was horrific.
What year was this?
This was 1999.
Still
2000.
99, okay.
Yeah, so going through to 2000, I was having 6 months of chemo. So that was pretty awful. And that was a really high dose, and I'd managed to get my oncologist to actually chop it down a little bit. After about 3 months, I wailed about how awful it was, and I think actually if I'd carried on having that high dose, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. So she did actually drop down the dose after about 3 months, and frankly, I'm sure that's saved me. I'm not a fan of high dose chemo. I think it's a barbaric and outdated method of treatment. I'm not completely against chemo. I think low dose chemo, given in the right way, could be extremely beneficial, but we're not giving it like that.
I agree. And low dose chemo can be very helpful, especially in a crisis.
Absolutely.
If someone is like, they've got a tumor that's threatening to close up their
exactly.
throat or block their colon, sometimes you need to bring out the big guns.
Well, sometimes you need 1 mega dose or something like that just to sort of bring it down, and then you do the low dose. But we're not doing it in a complex cocktail in order to target all the different pathways. I mean, that's only getting the fast dividing cell, and as you know, that leaves the stem cell behind, does nothing for the stem cell.
And let's unpack that just a bit for folks that are completely new to this idea. What chemotherapy drugs do is they, like you just said, they target the rapidly dividing cells, but to simplify, there's basically 2 types of cancer cells. There are the rapid dividers and the slow dividers. And the slow dividers, which typically don't respond to chemotherapy, those are the cancer stem cells.
Exactly.
And those are the ones that started the whole mess in the first place. And what a lot of chemotherapy drugs do is, they shrink a tumor because they kill these fast-growing cells, and everybody thinks it's working, this is great, right? But what's happening sort of behind the scenes is they are making those cancer stem cells more aggressive.
Right, and because what's happening is you get this debris. When you kill off a whole load of cancer stem cells, fast dividing cells, you provide lots of debris in the area for those cancer stem cells that have been left behind to then engulf and use in a different way. And they use a sort of a method where they sort of ruffle their membrane, and then it's a process called autophagy. And this is a really aggressive form of how the cancer stem cell feeds, and that makes it more aggressive. So long term, you get a much more aggressive cancer because the cancer finds making nucleotides, which are little chunks of DNA, really quite energy, really hard for it to make. So if it can just scoop these things up without actually having to make them, it will do that. And that's exactly how it starts to feed, and that's why it gets more and more aggressive. And it's a very it's one of the methods I've got in my Metro map in here to show, how it changes and the way the stem cell actually starts to feed itself. So
and the other little component of this problem is that not only do in many cases chemotherapy treatments make the cancer stem cell more aggressive, they also cause immune system damage and suppression. And so now you have 2 things working against you. You have a suppressed immune system and more aggressive cancer, right? And so many people watching this have seen this happen in people they care about, where they got a treatment, everything seemed fine, and then it just came raging back, and it was all over their body. And so anyway, and we're rabbit trailing, but I just want to establish that so people understand, if they're brand new to cancer and they're trying to understand treatment and the way cancer cells operate, this is important.
And actually, it is key that people understand the damage to the immune system, because if you'd left enough of the immune system behind, and if you'd had a lower dose, which didn't affect the gut so much and didn't affect weight, because that's where your immune system is mostly based, around the gut. So if that had been left behind, you would have a chance of maybe trying to overcome some of those cancer stem cells with your immune system. But of course, we completely wipe it out with these high doses, which is crazy. So what we need to be looking at, ideally, and I challenge the oncology profession over this, is to be including more of a cocktail of, I've kind of gone down a middle route. So instead of just doing the traditional stuff, the chemo, the radio and the surgery, and sometimes immunotherapy, and I also did the natural side, the intravenous vitamin C, I did the detoxing, I did all of that stuff and added a multitude of supplements. But I also did this middle road. And the reason for that was because after my stage 4, which had spread to my lungs, in 2003 I discovered I had a condition called myelodysplasia. I also had a deleted p53 gene in my blood, so I mean it was going to be an explosion into, it was developing into a very acute myeloid leukemia, and that was behaving in a different way. So whatever I was doing to keep my stage 4 cervical cancer under control wasn't working on the leukemia. And the reason for that, I've since discovered, is because they have different feeding patterns. So I was going low GI with my diet. I was, more of a paleo kind of pescatarian, high fiber.
Low carb, basically.
Absolutely. So that was starving the glucose, but actually what the leukemia was doing was feeding on glutamine. So, and that's a really tricky thing to try and stop. So, I mean, there are 3, and I've developed, throughout my book, I've kind of developed my ideas into sort of what I call my metro map, and that's kind of like the crux of my book. And I've got to just show you this here. So this is my metro map, and it shows the 3 things that the cancer will, this is the cancer stem cell, what it will feed off. So it feeds not just on glucose, but it feeds on glutamine, which is a protein, and it's the most abundant amino acid in your body, but it also feeds off fatty acids as well, and people don't understand the fat intake and how important that is to sort of block that as well. And there are several feeding lines for that as well. So
let's talk about this.
Okay, it's a complex area.
But we can simplify it.
Yeah, this is kind of my simple version, in that's how it started, with a very simple triangle, thinking that the diet effectively has 3 macros in it: fat, carb, protein.
Yeah.
And the cancer stem cell will learn to use whatever it can to feed itself. Let's just put that down. So it'll use whatever it can to just feed itself. So if it can't get glucose, it'll use glutamine. If it can't get, it'll swap round. I call it the metro map because, I describe this as kind of my Piccadilly Circus analogy, where if you're looking down at Piccadilly Circus on in an evening and you see all the sort of lights and everybody's really busy going in different directions, that's kind of like the genetic mutations, which can go off in all sorts of different directions. But what you don't see is the metro underneath. And these are the metabolic fuel lines. I kind of liken it to metabolic fuel lines that come into Piccadilly Circus. There are a few more lines there than you've got Piccadilly Circus. But the same effect in that if you block one line, you can reroute, you can go onto the underground, go back around and come back in a different route. And this is what happens when you block glucose, it comes back in and uses a different one. So
the way I would describe this,
yeah,
in a simple way, is there's a fundamentally misunderstood idea that has been propagated across the world, and that is sugar feeds cancer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not that simple.
It's not that simple. So, yes, every cell in your body pretty much runs on glucose. And yes, cancer cells use glucose for fuel. That's true. Yes, PET scans use a glucose tracer. But this idea that if you just starve the cancer cell of sugar, then it kills it, right? So, well, if we just eat a diet that's ketogenic and it's all fat and no sugar, it'll starve the cancer. But what happens, and what Jane's saying is, cancer cells can flip switches, metabolic switches, so in the absence of sugar, they can use fat for fuel. In the absence of sugar and fat, they can use glutamine, which is an amino acid, for fuel. So cancer cells can use protein, fat, and carbs for fuel.
Correct.
Right.
And ketones.
And ketones especially. And some cancer cells prefer fat for fuel. And I wrote an article called The Evidence Against the Ketogenic Diet for Cancer, which I'll link to, but it talks about there are certain cancers that prefer a ketogenic diet. Like, it makes them grow faster. So you really need to understand your type of cancer first before you jump on a dietary bandwagon necessarily.
Yeah.
But
and that's kind of where I'm trying to go in my book, is to teach people what their metabolic phenotype is, and that's how it expresses, because the cancer stem cell will behave differently depending on the location in the body, and depending on the other influences around. So it's all the epigenetics, how the diet is affecting it, how the the pathogens in the area, inflammation. There's a whole host of different things that influence how the cancer stem cell will behave.
Now, how did you figure this out?
Lots of research. Lots and lots of research. So I started off...
Let's go back in time, because this was around 2004 when you were starting to get sick again, right?
Yeah, so I had this issue where I had this myelodysplasia, and I knew that whatever I was doing so far was not keeping this other cancer at bay. So I didn't want to have more chemo. That was clear. That was not going to be the answer for me. That's what started it in the first place. So I looked masses of research.
Do you think the chemotherapy, the leukemia, was a result of the chemotherapy?
Oh yeah, and the radiotherapy as well. In fact, probably the radiotherapy to my bone marrow around the pelvis was key.
This is not uncommon.
No.
Leukemia is a well-known side effect of certain chemotherapy and radiotherapy treatments.
And I think they gave me such a high dose, but they didn't expect me to survive. So,
Yeah, you won't live long enough to get the leukemia.
Exactly. So the fact that I did, and I think this is probably something we'll see more of, unfortunately, as a condition, a secondary leukemias for people who are managing to survive. So I think it's quite important and key that people understand there are things that aren't necessarily chemo that you can take. And I kind of did this middle road. So I looked at everything that I was doing, wasn't enough. I then went back to the medical research and thought, I wonder if there are some old drugs that have been left out or forgotten. There must be something out there. And I was sure that the answer was there. I was so convinced that I would find it. And I tell you what, I just dug and dug and dug. And I went back to the 1980s for research, and I found an old drug called dipridamol, which is an antiplatelet drug. Now, back in the 80s, there was research coming out. A lady called Betty Rhodes, she's a dermatologist, had done some work in Kingston and London. And she'd given dipridamol to stage 4 melanoma patients, and they had no progression at all. And she wrote something in the Lancet, and I came across this, and it was just screamed to me that this was stopping some of the growth factors. It was blocking the way it was metastasizing, and melanoma normally is rampant. So,
and which pathway does dipridamol target?
Okay, well, it targets a cholesterol pathway called SREP2.
Yep, that's a fatty acid pathway.
Yeah,
because melanoma likes fat.
Correct.
Cholesterol.
Exactly. So that's kind of why it like that. But also autophagy, which is because it's a nucleoside transport inhibitor, so it stops these chunks of DNA getting back into the cell. That's why it helped as well with any kind of scooping up, because I think melanoma does a lot of this kind of scooping up and affecting the terrain, the surrounding area of the cancer cell, because it's not just the cancer cell itself. You get all sorts of problems happening in the surrounding area, even with fibroblasts and things producing lactate. But there's a whole host of things that you need to be targeting to stop the cancer stem cell from refeeding itself. So the dipridamol to me was, okay, so that may stop the protein. And I didn't quite think, so I thought, right, okay, protein, fat, carbs. So I looked at that and I thought, well, the dipridamol will help stop some of the protein uptake. I was already on a low GI diet, so I thought, well, I'm stopping the sugar. But I come across this herb, which nobody else seemed to be, it's an old Chinese herb, nobody seemed to know about, called berberine. I was taking it in a tincture form in something called Mahonia aquifolium, and I come across it in a journal of, I can't remember which journal it was, but anyway, so it was talking about all the benefits of this particular nutrient. So it had anti-inflammatory effects, it had great effects on sort of improving the gut, but it also had these huge anti-cancer effects because it was lowering glucose. And I thought, okay, that'll boost that glucose, the carb, so I'll reduce that. So I've got the dipridamol, I've got the berberine,
So yeah, targeting fat with
Yeah.
dipridamol, you're
Yeah.
targeting glucose with
Yeah.
berberine.
Yeah,
And
then
blocking
the fat,
is a better word, but yeah.
Yeah, and then I read some research in the Life Extension magazine. We're talking way back when, and it came out with some stuff about lovastatin, which is one of the first statins to be on the market, and it's a lipophilic or lipophilic statin, so it's fat loving. Not all statins work, okay, and people probably have their own little ideas about whether they like statins or don't like statins. There's a lot of misinformation out there, huge amount of misinformation about whether statins cause cancer, which, you know, the hydrophilic ones can stimulate cancer, because what they do is they go into the body, they go to the liver, and then they actually trigger the liver to reduce its cholesterol, and the rest of the body overcompensates and produces more cholesterol to make up for that. So for lung cancer, for example, they've shown that pravastatin, which is a hydrophilic statin, doesn't work because it does exactly that. It goes to the liver. Pravastatin is the wrong statin to use. But I use this one called lovastatin, and that's seemed to work for cervical, for head and neck. So all of these, and it was keeping people stable, and that's what I wanted at the time. I didn't care about sort of, you know, whether I could cure. I never thought I would be in remission. My goal was just to survive just a little bit longer.
And let me interrupt you. Did you, some of these studies you found, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
but they were basically studies where they were following cancer patients
Yes.
who also happened to be taking a statin, right, a lovastatin, and they had, you know, better survival or no progression. And there's like, oh, there's a little clue here, right?
Yeah. Well, I think actually this was a specific, this particular one was a specific study on statins done in Ontario. Anyway, they discovered they were all being kept stable. They didn't do the trial for very long, but for the months that they were on this statin, they got no progression. So that to me was kind of like, haha. So let's look at that. And then I came across more research that said if you add a non-steroidal with the statin, that it makes it 5 times more effective. So that was okay, right, well, we'll probably get a better effect. And if there's synergy between those two things, and the non-steroidal that was suggested, because it has less effects on the gut, it's a COX-2 inhibitor, was a drug called Todolac. And I managed to get my oncologist, believe it or not, to prescribe both the Todolac and the lovastatin, because in fact it turned out when I asked her, she said, oh, I've been looking at statins because there is this talk about them having these anti-cancer effects. I didn't know which ones were going to be beneficial, but you brought some great info, and yeah, you're stage 4. I never told her at the time that I had this blood issue, because if she knew that, because I'd got that diagnosed elsewhere, but if she'd known that, she would have wanted to give me more chemo. So I didn't want that.
I understand.
So,
Yep.
So
that
I
was
didn't.
smart.
Yeah. Well.
And she, by law, she would have really had to say, no, I can't do this. I need to have to treat you this other way.
Yeah.
Right.
Although actually, I think the rules and regs have got much stricter for doctors and oncologists since that time. And if you step out of line, you get your wrists severely slapped, and you can be up in front of the GMC or whoever. Just it's a hard job for oncologists to look out, and that's why they don't. They're scared, partly.
Yeah, who wants to lose their profession?
Exactly.
Right.
So, but she was happy at the time, and she was open-minded, and that's why I had her on my team, because she had this approach to me that was, okay, well, you've done some good research. And I didn't tell her everything I was doing. There's no way I would tell her I was doing intravenous vitamin C or all of the myriad of supplements. She would have thought I was completely bonkers. But anyway, so I used to tell her little snippets here and there, but I certainly didn't tell her everything. So I then put together this cocktail, and I had another marker done, which is called the TM2PK, and this tests for the abnormal macrophages and the pyruvate kinase, which is a result of abnormal metabolism in the cancer cells. And this shows up one of the pathways that I got on my chart, which is glycolysis. So that's what happens in most cancer cells. As soon as you get cancer beginning, you get this process where the manufacture of ATP is happening in the cell cytoplasm, so in the fluidy bit outside of the nucleus and outside of the mitochondria. So it's not happening in the mitochondria normally. So it goes into the cytoplasm, you get this production of ATP in the cytoplasm instead, and it's far less efficient than the ATP that's manufactured in the mitochondria.
And it's kind of like a fermentation
process.
It is,
exactly.
Right?
It's like a yeasty fermentation process. So that's the glycolysis process that happens.
Just so anybody doesn't understand, so they do, this is a mechanism by which the cancer cells are able to create their own fuel.
Yeah, and they kind of do that under conditions where there is less oxygen as well, because the normal production of ATP is done in the mitochondria, those little bacteria-shaped things that we have in our cells. But after a while, you actually get those being upregulated as well. So they start overproducing the ATP as well. So it's not just in the cytoplasm you get this aerobic glycolysis. You also get this extra, what's known as oxphos, oxidative phosphorylation. But that happens in the mitochondria more in cancer cells. So you get more of the mitochondria being supercharged, and this is something that people don't understand, because what happens is that you get this effect in the fibroblasts around the cell as well. They start producing lactate by going through this glycolysis process, and the lactate is then used as a fuel, goes back into the normal Krebs cycle, and then goes back into the oxphos. So you get this extra production of ATP as a result of everything going on, and the cell is supercharged then, and it's going through this rapid division all the time, and to do that it needs energy and it needs the nutrients, fat and protein, in order to create the new cells, because new cells are effectively protein bound by a coating of fat. So that's what they need protein and they need fat as well. So my thought was just to block all of those things. It's like a sort of a factory, so you need to block all the things that are in that factory chain.
And it becomes a very efficient factory too, right?
Yeah.
And that's why cancer starts to grow and divide so quickly, is it all these connections are made, and like you said, supercharge is a good word, but it figures out like how to just grow and spread fast. And so it gets a little complicated which we can touch on too here, I guess, is that there are multiple pathways for each fuel source. So, which you can touch on, and it gets really sciencey, okay? But we're trying to keep it simple, just so you understand.
Yeah, you
right?
can watch this again.
Yeah, rewatch it and read her book, for sure.
Yes, read the book.
But protein, fat, and carbs all fuel cancer growth, and each. She's got a little chart here, but each pathway, let's just say the protein, I'll point here, but like this is the protein pathway. There are multiple ways in chemical reactions that a cancer stem cell can use protein. So it's like you want to block each pathway.
Yeah.
And different compounds do that.
Exactly. And if you were to block, say, for example, mTOR, which is an enzyme that sort of gathers all the proteins together before the cell divides. If you block that, it then uses this process of autophagy to sort of grab the extracellular fat and protein anyway. So you block one, and then just reroutes and comes back in
with
through
another
that way.
one.
Yeah, and I've kind of got a theory on tamoxifen, which most people think causes cancer long term, and I think the reason for that is because you block the tamoxifen, which actually tamoxifen actually has this IGF-1 blocking effect. So if you take this for long enough, the cancer stem cell goes, okay, well, I'll just use glucose instead. Possibly. This is my theory. And endometrial cancer is probably the most glucose driven cancer. Okay, most people think the brain or whatever, but actually that feeds off glutamine. It also feeds off acetate as well. But endometrial is very glucose fueled, and that's the cancer that it ends up causing long term.
Right.
And I think this is so. If you were to block all of these pathways at the same time as you're having tamoxifen, your risk of actually having a secondary cancer, I think, would be very, very low. So or non-existent if you were to do it properly. So that is my theory. So whether it's right or not, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. It makes a lot of sense too, because tamoxifen, although it can lower breast cancer recurrence risk, but then it increases ovarian cancer risk. I just interviewed Dr. Christy Funk, who's an MD, and she had found some research that was pretty fascinating about that compared soy consumption to tamoxifen. It had the same effect.
Right.
Same reduction in risk, which was pretty interesting. So, but the point is, like, so there's multiple pathways for each fuel source.
Yep.
And as you're starting to uncover this, you identified each pathway, and like just on this chart, I mean, just so everybody understands, like there's 5 pathways here just for glucose, right? There's another 6 pathways here for glutamine, and then there's, I don't know, maybe 7 pathways or 8, depending on how you look at it, I guess, but pathways for fatty acids. And so what she has on this chart, which is going to be hard to read from on the video, but these are all different compounds that Jane figured out target these different pathways. Some of them are natural compounds, some of them are pharmaceuticals, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But you were starting to talk about berberine, and then we got on this like sort of rabbit trail, which has been good. But berberine is kind of like an anti-cancer superstar, right?
It is.
So
massive.
talk about it.
So it's always billed as kind of a natural alternative to metformin. Metformin is something I came across in 2007 and actually added that into my cocktail as well. But the reason they both work, they both affect the gut predominantly. They all say that it affects the liver production of insulin, blah blah blah. But that it's actually more the effects in the gut that produce a sort of a lowering of the glucose to the rest of the body. So if you get tested for something like metformin or even berberine, it won't necessarily pick up the fact that it's having a systemic effect, which is much more beneficial than the direct effect on the cancer stem cell itself. So it is a superstar. It's a massive superstar, berberine, because it has these anti-inflammatory effects. It also does all these other pathways as well. It affects something called SERP1, which is the acetate pathway. So if somebody was to do the ketogenic diet, you wouldn't do that on its own because you run the risk of it using acetate, but actually berberine can help that. So it's a matter of getting the correct cocktail together, which is key here. And
just on the berberine thing, so berberine, it targets mTOR up here on the glutamine pathway.
Yep.
It targets, what is
OXPHOS, actually, on this side.
OXPHOS on glucose.
Yeah, because the mitochondria are like ancient bacteria. That's effectively what they are. And it's a natural antibiotic, actually, berberine. So that's why it affects the mitochondria in the same way that doxycycline will help OXPHOS. And there's a professor called Professor Lasanti who's done a lot of research. Michael
Lasanti, yep.
Yep, he's done a lot of research in Manchester in the UK, looking at the combination of doxycycline and vitamin C.
And doxycycline is an antibiotic.
Yeah,
right.
Very common, but it doesn't affect your gut microbiome in the same way that most antibiotics do. People get very scared about antibiotics, but this one is more metabolized further up the gut, has less effect on the microbiome than most.
And then berberine targets a fatty acid pathway too.
Yep. So exactly. But you kind of don't get this, and just to go back to the doxy and the vitamin C is blocking this aerobic glycolysis. So if you take the combination of the two, you get a blocking of both, because if you block one, like I said, it reworks and goes back up this other pathway, and likewise the other way as well. So you need to be blocking both at the same time, and that's the key, is to get the cocktail right for your cancer. Because actually some cancers don't use that very much. Prostate cancer uses mostly fat and glutamine.
Mm-hmm. Fat and protein. This is why we see so many people who go to a plant-based diet have dramatic turnaround of prostate cancer. In fact, one of the best studies on diet and cancer was on prostate cancer patients with Dr. Dean Ornish.
That's right.
And he put them on a low-fat plant-based diet with exercise and stress reduction.
Yep.
And all of their PSAs went down doing this, because it is so sensitive to protein and fat. Like, it really loves those. So it's one example.
I know somebody who's prostate cancer sufferer went on the ketogenic diet and his PSA went up to over 600. So it's very much, of course, the type of fat is critical as well, but every type of cancer has a particular signature, metabolic signature, and it's a matter of trying to find out what that is. So like I said, endometrial was very glucose driven. Prostate is very different as well. It's got this quite unique sort of feeding pattern with the fat and the glutamine. Melanoma, like we said, is very fat driven.
What else?
So breast cancer, for example, also likes all the hormonal cancers, ovarian, breast, prostate, like fat. Okay, and this is why statins for all of those work really, really well. And people shouldn't fear
statins interfere with
the cholesterol uptake. Now, when you've got your baby daughter cells, they need cholesterol blobs on the surface. Every single cancer cell will need cholesterol. Okay, so what you're doing is you're depleting the effect of being able to make this new daughter cell. So if you're to block both SREBP2 and a statin, so I use the combination of lovastatin, dipridamole, those are the two key cholesterol pathways. So I did that, and it totally blocked out the ability of my leukemia to make the fat. The dipridamole also worked on the nucleoside salvage. The berberine worked on the glucose side. It disappeared. 7 months later, I had my TM2 PK done again, and then I had, other tests done as well, and it showed that everything had gone. So,
so for you, your protocol, just to people might have missed this. So your protocol at that time for your cancer was basically four drug compounds?
There were more natural supplements than that. Okay. Because I was also blocking glutamine, to be honest.
Just run through each one that you did at that time.
Goodness.
I know.
Golly, I don't know that I can go through every single one.
Well, high dose, IV vitamin C.
It's in the book.
Yep. Berberine.
So I did, the main ones would have been drinking green tea throughout the day.
Which that's on here.
Yeah.
Green tea blocks one of these pathways.
Yes, it does. And it actually helps to block the glutamine transport. So
curcumin blocks the pathway. Exactly.
And that works really well with something called ursolic acid. Now, I didn't use that at the time, but I have since embraced that into my I still take a whole load of supplements every day. But there's a whole load of other supplements as well that we're targeting. I had Gymnema, I don't actually know how to pronounce it, Gymnema. Anyway, it's another sort of blocking one for glucose, which I used.
Resveratrol?
I definitely took resveratrol. What else? I took...
and then the pharmaceuticals that you took at that time?
Loads of fish oils. Very important to take those, because they actually, if you take the right oils, they will block the uptake of the bad fat. So omega-3s. Omega-3s, absolutely. Yeah, really critical. And they're also very anti-inflammatory as well, so that was kind of key. What else? Oh, immune boosting stuff. I did stuff to, I thought there was some hormonal possible component with my cervical, so I took indole-3 carbinol, a whole load of things, which, long list.
Yeah. And that stuff's in the book too.
Yeah.
But the drugs that you took, the off-label drugs, there was only like 3 or 4 at that time?
It was lovastatin, dipridamole, the non-steroidal. Those were the 3 that I took at the time.
How similar was that? We haven't talked about.
And then berberine, but I then switched to metformin.
Got it.
And then later on, I took, to reboot my immune system, I took a drug which is over the counter over here, and we can't get it in the UK very easily, but it's a drug called Tagamet. Yeah, cimetidine, which helped to reboot my immune system. There's a lot of research on this, and because my immune system was so rubbish after all the chemo and everything. I mean, I've suffered kind of long-term damage to my lungs as a result, but...
we didn't talk about low-dose aspirin, which is another compound.
God, I completely missed the aspirin. Yeah, so I was... that's really key. And actually, if you combine it, and the key is actually to combine it with metformin or berberine, because they stop 2 critical pathways on both the protein and the glucose side. It's kind of a fatty, it's the way...
There's a synergy.
Yeah, synergy between the two. Aspirin will also work on COX-2 as sort of inflammatory side as well, obviously, as a non-steroidal. So it's, it has multiple effects, aspirin, and it's a VEGF inhibitor as well, so it works on growth factors. So it has all these, and what you want are drugs that target many different things at the same time, and this is what the lovastatin was doing. It was blocking GLUT1, which is the glucose receptor that gets upregulated with cancer cells. In your muscles you have GLUT4, but in your cancer cells they get this extra receptors going up GLUT1 receptors, which pull in more glucose into the cell, and statins block that. So they block not just the fat; they also work on the GLUT1 receptor as well.
Talk about mebendazole.
Yeah.
Which is a pinworm drug, right?
Yeah.
And where does that fit into the picture?
Okay, well, I didn't put it on the chart here, but it does actually, because it affects the microtubules in the cancer stem cell, or all of them actually, all the cancer cells. It actually disrupts the way that they line up. Most cells, when they go through division, they have to line everything up. The spindles inside have to all line up and be nice and neat, so it divides neatly. And that's what this drug does. And in fact, it's so similar to a very toxic chemo called vincristine. Works in the same way. But you could actually swap the vincristine for mebendazole, which is virtually non-toxic. I mean, you know, they give it to kids. And you have to have an extremely high dose to have, you know, over a long term, to have any real issues with it. So they've actually started investigating mebendazole for kids with brain tumors and things, and they've had excellent results.
Are there any other drugs in that class, like anti-parasitic?
Yeah, there's many actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so I discuss all. I have a Facebook group which discusses more than the drugs that I did. I mean, I've tried to embrace as many of these because there's loads out there. I mean, one guy said he's investigated up to 7,000 drugs with anti-cancer effects, which
that's
are kind
a lot of pills.
That's a lot of pills. But they all have as a particular anti-cancer effect. But he's started something called the Ecology clinic, which is doing a very, very similar protocol to the one I put together.
Yep.
And they started off in Harley Street back in 2014, 15. Anyway, so they're now treating patients through their study to actually see how this cocktail with all these different drugs, and mebendazole is one of the drugs that they use. But there are other antiparasitics which are very effective. Niclosamide is one, but unfortunately it needs to be in sort of more nanoparticles probably to be more effective. But still, there's one that's used for animals called fenbendazole, which is very similar. It's almost identical really to mebendazole. There may be slight differences in terms of particular areas where they work, because they also work on the cell signaling that happens right at the start of the cancer journey. And I've got a different diagram in my book which kind of runs through. I've rewritten the whole of how cancer, you remember all the hallmarks of cancer which are written by Hanahan and Weinberg. Too confusing for words, particularly for the layperson. So I've kind of put it into a very basic progression of what happens. So it starts with abnormal cell signaling, and mebendazole will actually affect the hedgehog signaling, sonic hedgehog, which is kind of triggered, and all of these signals that you get at the beginning trigger this abnormal metabolism, which is my metro map. That's the triangle there, the glutamine, the fat, and the protein, the glutamine, fat, and the glucose. So that then leads to more growth factors being secreted. So you get this secretion of VEGF, but you also get other ones which are completely ignored by the medical profession at the moment. So you get platelet-derived growth factor, fibroblast growth factor. You've got things called MMPs, matrix metalloproteases, which are also key because they help keep the integrity of the surrounding area of the cancer cell and prevent the cancer cell. Once you get this breakdown with these enzymes, it breaks down this area so that the cells can actually break off and travel. So you need to keep the MMPs inhibited. And this is kind of, the doxycycline, one of the drugs that is used by the Carillon Ecology clinic, is an MMP inhibitor, and dipridamole, one of the ones that I use, is an MMP. So again, it's sort of getting drugs with multiple targets all the way through. Mebendazole does, it affects on the cell signaling. It also affects the GLUT1. It's an MMP2 inhibitor. Helps the immune system, and it works like a chemotherapy drug. Wow. So it hits every single one right the way across, and no wonder it's getting great results.
And this is just a drug for pinworms, literally. I mean,
exactly.
It's like a drug that if you took it, all prescription drugs have potential side effects, but there's a lot of them that when you take them, you don't even feel anything. Some of
these drugs like metformin, you may get sort of gut reaction to start with, and I kind of find that happens more with people who have a dysbiosis anyway, so they have the wrong flora-fauna balance, and metformin and berberine have this effect in the gut anyway, very similar. You can get similar gut reaction even with berberine, less so generally, but the metformin kind of, what it does is it re-regulates, and both are very effective for the immune system, actually, both berberine and metformin.
I take berberine, by the
yeah.
way. Jane turned me on to it a few years ago when I first kind of started following her and paying attention to what she was doing, and I was very skeptical. Let me just say, I was like, what is this, all this drug stuff? And man, she's really into the drug stuff. Like, I'm not sure about this lady, right? Yeah. And but as I paid more attention, as you can tell, Jane is very smart. She really understands the biology of cancer cells at a whole nother level. And it took a little time for me to be convinced, and then I was. And I was like, okay, she's onto something. This is legit, and people need to know about it. Obviously, that's why we're doing this interview. So the question now, I think people they're like, okay, well, so like, what do I do, right? Yeah. What do I do? Well, first thing I want to encourage you to do is get her book and read it, because she's got an amazing story. It's a crazy story, much more like ups and downs than she was able to tell here. But then also the second half of the book is really all about this, the science of targeting cancer stem cells from every angle and using natural compounds and some specific pharmaceuticals to do that.
Yeah.
So then question number 2 is, well, how do I, if I wanted to get these drugs, like, low dose, off-label drugs, how do I do that?
So you've got, you have various options. You might be able to persuade your own doctor to prescribe some of them if some of them are more malleable than others.
But the book typically really helps. The book helps.
Yeah, because people are actually taking this into their oncologist and saying, can you help me work, because I've got the metro map in here, and say, help me work out what drugs on this chart I really need. Because even if you don't understand the science, the key here is to ask people for help. So you can either ask on the Facebook group is cluttered with all sorts of stuff, but you can search, on my Facebook group and find all sorts of information. But the oncologist is really meant to help to get you better, and they don't understand the metabolism. They do not understand how the cancer stem cell works. They don't even know that that's kind of really a targetable option. They don't understand that there are these drugs available and how they work. So patients are, the fantastic thing is that I'm going from a grassroots with the patients. They're going into the oncologist saying, help me work this out. The oncologist is then looking at the metro map and going, oh yeah, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to sort of, starve it a little bit, and okay. And then they read the book and they're recommending it to other patients, which is phenomenal. So it's sort of going up the tree to the oncologist and then coming back to the grassroots with the patients and affecting more patients. So I'm absolutely really pleased at the way that it's being received, actually.
And there are a few clinics that you could work with remotely.
There is the clinic that I discovered in Harley Street. I'm amazed that somebody I've been trying for years to get.
This is London.
This is in London. So I've been talking to other patients saying, try and get on these off-label drugs on top of what you're doing, and they'd never achieve it. I was so lucky to get my oncologist to prescribe the 2 drugs that I did. The other ones I got from complementary doctors. So the key here is to find somebody who will prescribe, and you're lucky if you have an oncologist who will. I mean, really lucky. There are integrative doctors out there who will prescribe, but there is this care oncology clinic as well, which prescribe the 4. May not be enough for you. And in some cases, quite a lot of cases, I don't think it is. You need to be targeting more. And what I've done in my metro map is kind of combine what they've done and what I've done, and possibly some other stuff as well. So, you're getting as many options as you possibly can to try and target and get that cocktail, because that's what we're missing. We have a cocktail for curing HIV, but we don't have this cocktail for cancer. And both are complex diseases, You cannot cure a cancer with just chemo, which is kind of targeting the fast dividing cell, but ignoring, this is the kind of the stem cell here before it evolves into the fast dividing cell. We do a little bit of immunotherapy. Some people are given Avastin, which is for, blocking the growth factors. but effectively, most of this is ignored. Anything beyond that, going back to the cell signaling, is completely ignored. So that's where we need to be targeting, working out what is the initial triggering factor, because that kind of drives the progression of the cancer, and then working out, what growth factors are more important, what are the metabolic drivers, and you can research all of this for particular cancers. I'm probably slightly ahead of myself because I don't think they've done enough research on this yet, but it's sort of accumulating out there in the PubMed articles and things. And the key is to try and learn a little bit, if you can, some of these words on the metro map. You don't need to understand what they are particularly. Who knows what the mevalonate pathway? Well, most people, I know what the mevalonate pathway is, but most people have no clue.
Yeah,
okay,
no.
But it's a cholesterol pathway that statins work on. So as long as you just know the basics, you can kind of look up and you can learn to start to read some of the literature and try and spot some of these things and see how relevant they are to your particular cancer. And you can start to work out a kind of a picture and a drug combination that would be really good for you. You can't prescribe these things to yourself. You need to have a doctor, obviously, to prescribe everything. This is not something that you do at home.
Right.
Not safe. So you need to be overseen with everything. All drugs have side effects.
Yep, and when they're combined, there can be synergistic benefit, but also
Exactly.
synergistic toxicity. So
yeah, and you need to keep that low, and you also need, but there are some natural supplements which can be potentially harmful as well. So you've got to look very carefully at the whole complex picture that you're building up, and just get an integrative doctor on board. I suggest you get, you go to the Care Oncology, you get an integrative doctor. And you involve your normal oncologist as much as possible, because this is kind of like my mission, is to try and get the oncology profession to change and to understand the metabolism, because it's totally ignored, and they really haven't got the concept that this is the stem cell and this is how we should be targeting it, because starving it, cancer is like a parasite. It will feed, and it will continue to feed as long as there is food available. But if you can block it down without starving yourself, and that's why I call it How to Starve Cancer Without Starving Yourself, is use these drugs and supplements to target the cancer. Because people will probably say things like, oh, I don't need a statin because my cholesterol levels are fine. That's not the point.
Right.
You're trying to use the statin to target...
As an anti-cancer drug, not as a cholesterol drug.
It's absolutely not targeting you systemically. It's targeting the metabolism of the cancer stem cell itself. And that is key for people to understand, because a lot of people go, oh, I don't need it. But that is not the case. It has an own little metabolism of its own. The cancer stem cells and the cancer tumour bulk will be behaving in a way which is different to the rest of your body, and it's that bit that you actually need to be targeting with these particular drugs and supplements to really slow it down and to halt the growth. And so once you've done that, once you've made it really weak, because it does weaken it, you can then kill it much easier with low dose chemo or intravenous vitamin C, anything that will sort of trigger this apoptosis process.
Yep. And so if your head is spinning, it's okay, because it's a lot to take in and understand. But just, again, the basic recap here is that cancer cells, the cancer stem cells, are the real enemy, right?
Yeah.
And they have 3 different fuel sources: protein, fat, and carbs. And they can switch between them. Some prefer one over the other, but they can switch. So this is I love this because really, it's a holistic approach, right? It's holistic, it's comprehensive. We're targeting every angle of cancer, right? And in order to solve this problem, in order to make the body a place where cancer can't thrive. Now, the off-label drugs are not something you would take forever necessarily.
No.
But and the other cool thing is, I know this is all emerging and you're continually researching, but there's a lot of natural compounds in food, in fruits and vegetables, in herbs, that are hitting a lot of these targets that we don't even understand yet.
Yep.
And so, as I'm sure, as more...
I've already updated this since I published it.
Yeah.
And it's not a matter of taking stuff out. It's things that I've then since discovered, and I thought, well, I'll put that into because you can add into the Metro Map, other options that people can take. So more natural stuff, or more, I find another off-label drug, which is really key, So, I've already, this is an updated version of my original one already. And the fact is that I've self-published, so I can do that.
Keep updating,
I can keep updating as often as I like, really.
It's not as easy with the publisher. No. You have to wait like years.
Yeah.
But just one example is in the GLUT1 pathway. There's 2 that she has listed here, which is statin or quercetin, right? Many of you that follow me know that quercetin is sort of like on the same level of curcumin as a very powerful anti-cancer flavonoid.
Yeah, very.
So again, there are natural compound options, but there's still more to learn.
Absolutely.
So what I'll do is I'll in the show notes, if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook or wherever, in the show notes on the blog, we will link to resources and studies, and so you can really dive further in. Of course, I'll link to her book, but
and my group as well. I
and
think
she has a private Facebook
amount.
group.
Yeah.
Very active group. Jane McLelland, Off-Label Drugs for Cancer is the Facebook group. I'm in there. I'm paying attention to the studies that are being shared and conversations that are happening in there because I think it's fascinating. So anyway, the point is like there's a lot to learn here, and there are more options out there for you than you realize.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, I just want to help people get well. And for some folks, like this could be the one key that's missing, with some targeted, low risk, low dose, off-label drugs. And again, we'll link to some resources and clinics and things because there's a handful in the US that are doing this kind of thing too, and that you could work with remotely, and just trying to help people survive. I mean, that's the deal, right?
It is. And I love the way that you're open and receptive to not just, the natural, but there is this middle path which kind of breaches both sides, and that's the key, is to try and get something that is really effective for you as an individual. Not everything's going to work for everybody, but you need to find something that's going to assist and make other things. So if you've got a stage 4 really aggressive cancer, you can't just rely on just diet or cannabis or whatever.
Depends.
It
depends. I mean, there are survivor stories, there are success stories, but
absolutely.
But sometimes
I do wonder whether there are other things though that they've done as well, which they haven't maybe kind of twigged at the time, and they think
possible.
Yeah, but definitely diet is very key, very key.
So zillions of dollars have been spent researching pharmaceutical drugs, right? So we have zillions of studies that are published, right? Where they've discovered the kind of things that Jane's talking about, where these discoveries have been made that there are certain drugs, certain pharmaceutical compounds that have anti-cancer effects in the body. Why aren't they being used in medicine? Because they're cheap.
They're off
drugs.
Patent.
They're not patent anymore. They're generic, right? And so that's good for you because they're inexpensive, but it's not good for the industry because there's no money in cheap, generic, off-label drugs like low-dose aspirin, right? So the cancer industry, by and large, is driven by the profit on chemotherapy drugs. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars every year in profit from those drugs. So, that's their focus. It's what's the next new blockbuster chemo or immunotherapy drug. I mean, these new drugs coming out cost $1 million a year. That's like the average new drug price. So you're trying to change the industry.
Totally.
I'm trying to. I mean, I am too. We're both kind of trying to do it from the ground up.
Totally.
But this again is just me trying to give you a little perspective and understand. Like, well, if there's all these drugs, why aren't they paying attention? Because there's no money in drugs like this, off-label drugs. There's no money in nutrition.
No.
And so, don't expect. Don't expect your oncologist to understand. I hope he does. Hope he's interested. But don't expect him to be. But the good thing is things are changing, and there's so much you can do to help yourself. And there are small clinics and practitioners, physicians, et cetera, oncologists that are waking up to this idea because they've seen how ineffective treatments are typically. It kind of reminds me of my oncologist who is deceased now, but he was in his 70s when I worked with him, and he was a career oncologist. And he came back out of retirement, started practicing again. That's when I found him, and he was doing IV vitamin C. He turned me on to aloe and mannose, he was studying Chinese medicine in his 70s because he was kind of like, well, you know, I've seen all that other stuff. Doesn't work very well.
No.
And I mean, I think he would have gotten really excited about this. I mean, I could just see his face if he had kind of stumbled across this stuff. He would have been prescribing off-label drugs, like very. I mean, you know, I could see it for sure because that's the kind of person he was. He just, at the end of the day, just wanted to get results and help people get well. So anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. Thank you, Jane. You are awesome. It's great to see you again. Thank you for sharing this. Again, we'll post links to all this stuff, and so you can, you know, it's not a one quick fix. This is kind of multifaceted and it's complex, but at the end of the day, you know, you're in charge of your healing journey. So you got to take control. You got to read. You got to research. You got to learn. You got to, you know, beat the bushes, right? And you know, this is a healing adventure, right? It's like, there's ups and downs.
A good way to think of it.
Yes.
It's an adventure.
It's an adventure. You have to look at it like an adventure, and it's a quest to find
experience. It's a real learning experience. It's a real opportunity to understand your body and to understand what it needs, what it's been lacking. You know, there's so many elements to this, which is really good for the personal growth as well. I think it's an opportunity. Yeah, and it's good to think about, you know, to project into the future and think about, you know, everything that I'm learning now I can use to help somebody else, right? And that's what you're doing. Yeah. That's what I'm doing. And that's what you should be doing and thinking about doing when you get well. So I think that's a pretty good place to stop. Please share this video with people you care about it, like it, share it, you know, do your thing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye. Bye.